You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Coming to you now from downtown, beautiful Spokane. It's Gary Krug and Long Waves. Today's show is entitled No Crime, No Punishment, the Coup of the Technocrats. Thank you for joining me today. It's nice to have you with me. I've got to say right at the top of the show that the opinions expressed on this show are solely my own and are not necessarily the opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. So let's just dive in here. I'm going to begin with the premise that a quiet coup has occurred in the United States. A quiet coup. A coup replacing the spirit, a coup replacing the laws, a coup replacing the purpose of our government is now completed. It's taken some years, you know. It really has. It didn't happen overnight. It's taken a while, some decades, but it is finished, and the evidence of this fact is undeniable. 20 years ago, the great Canadian writer John Ralston Saul noted that there was a problem. We, in the West, were having a problem around issues of obedience and responsibility. In short, he wrote, we are inundated with trials and official inquiries revolving around the same question of whether or not to obey orders. Whether or not to obey orders. And what are the orders that we're supposed to obey? Well, the first orders are to believe that what we're told is in fact true, not to question, to accept, but to accept, exactly what? Accept exactly what? An ideology, a way of seeing the world, a belief in the intense, perverse rationality of the technocratic corporate system. We're expected to believe those orders, that free markets produce free societies. And it's funny, if you look at the history of the great societies that emerged throughout Western culture, throughout Western history. In no instance are they reliant upon free markets. Free markets had nothing to do with the rise of these cultures. Think of Athens, think of Florence. Think of the Renaissance that broke out across Europe. It really wasn't about free markets. It was about people and ideas and free thought. Free thought. Saul continues along the vein that I cited a moment ago, writing, increasingly those who follow orders are being acquitted. Why? Because increasingly our society does not see social obligation as the primary obligation of the individual. The primary obligation is loyalty to the corporation. So the corporation can be literally corporations, which are filled with little technocrats running their schemes and their games. It can be the bureaucracy of the state, which is where we encounter corporatism at its most insane levels. It can be the belief in the ideological ravings of the neoconservatives, the neoliberals, the people who come out of government and go to think tanks and go back into government and then go into corporations and keep going through these revolving doors in this way. And increasingly, these people are being acquitted of whatever they do. Corporatism has been the coup. Rationality run mad, methods over outcome, and corporate growth over all other goods. The giveaway of all this, the tell, if you will, can be seen on the pages of the newspapers. It's right there. They're not even trying to hide it because they assume, and they assume with some disturbing correctness, that people have, by and large, slid back into the childhood of mass movements. They have assumed the attitudes of their masters. They have mommy and daddy taking care of them, and they can just slide back into unconsciousness. Another tell is the absence or the complete immateriality of facts. Because once you have a really good ideology going, like corporatism, and you've got the whole team bought into it, and it's all been structured into bureaucratic systems, once all of this is in place, facts just get in the way. Right? Facts just get in the way. They interrupt the flow of a good idea. So if the facts are immaterial, if the facts are absent, well, no one really misses them because they all have the right ideology. So if we tell you the economy is improving, the facts get in the way, so they'll either be dismissed or fudged. If the government says, we're winning the war in the Middle East, whichever war that is, the war against terror, and the facts get in the way, they're explained away, they're dismissed, or there's some dog and pony show to distract us. But the ideology reigns supreme, the corporation incarnate. Let's look at some examples. We all know about how did President Obama put it? Yeah, we tortured some people. Just kind of, yeah. I drove too fast. Yeah, I had too much to drink. We tortured some people. Torturers and their bosses and their enablers are still free. They are still free. We lock up people like John Kiriakou, for blowing the whistle on this, for revealing names and details. But the people who do it, the lawyers who made torture legal, the psychologists who wrote the torture manuals, little how-to books, the CIA officers who used torture, the elected officials who ordered and approved of it, and the most callous dismissal of the real damage being done to human beings, they're all free. They followed orders. Except for the people who originated the orders. But God knows we can't possibly prosecute anybody above the rank of, second lieutenant, maybe a captain. Now, captains tend to get off too. Second lieutenants, and any higher up you go into the hierarchy of government, people just walk. When was the last time you saw a government official, a major government official, go to jail? And it wasn't over something like banking or sex crimes or something like that. And usually they just resign and it goes away. But torture, you can get away with. You can get away with all kinds of things. You can destroy beaches in California and get away. You can destroy the Gulf of Mexico's ecosystem and pay some money and walk away. You can crash the world's economy and walk away. You can poison entire oceans. You can steal openly and get a fine, but nobody goes to jail. Nobody gets locked up. They followed orders. And the orders they followed were not necessarily the orders from people. They were the orders of the ideology. So everybody knows what's expected of them. Everyone knows how they're supposed to think. We begin wars without even discussing them. And the reasons for these wars are not even presented as clever lies, although they did a reasonable job with the clever lies on the run-up to the last Bush war, the war against Iraq. And they did a fairly good job. They had little flasks of pseudo-anthrax that Colin Powell could just show at the UN, and They had those cartoon drawings of the chemical trucks where the anthrax was being made because they didn't have any real pictures because the trucks didn't exist, and all the talk. And in fact, they knew the whole time that Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction. They knew, and they lied. I remember Bush even joking about it. Whoop, no weapons of mass destruction under my desk. That Barney Fife kind of comedic style he often had. No one's ever held to account. Not even the account of not being reelected. There is no blame. They get fabulously wealthy from it. Dick Cheney made, what, $40 billion for Halliburton out of the war? Was getting paid by Halliburton while he was vice president? I mean, really? General Petraeus, head of the CIA, lets his girlfriend and biographer get into his secret files from the CIA. And he gets a wrist slap and a fine that amounts to about half of 1 hour's speaking fee for him. You know, we got to wonder about what this looks like for us. We've got to put this in some perspective. There's a fellow who writes for Anti-War, Justin Raimondo, who had an interesting thought. He said, quote, "Faith in our government leaders, blind, worshipful suspension of disbelief, is what unites both wings of the Washington establishment. And this faith is almost religious in its intensity in the one institution where it should be entirely absent, the mainstream media. Yet it isn't at all surprising that instead of pursuing the many leads provided by Seymour Hersh in his reporting, they're busying themselves smearing and sneering at the man who exposed the My Lai massacre and the Abu Ghraib atrocities. After all, these are the same people who swallowed every lie put out by the Bush administration in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, broadcasting the elaborating on the phony intelligence promulgated by the neocons as a justification for what General William E. Odom accurately characterized as, quote, the worst disaster in American military history. But I want to take exception with Mr. Raimondo. I don't think it is our faith in our leaders which united us. I think it's our faith in our ideologies of corporatism and rationality. It's our faith in the groupthink of the technocrats, which now dominates contemporary society. And yes, the media do play a big role in that. But the media can also be deceived, sometimes willingly. Generally, they tend not to ask questions. Generally, they take whatever the government says and they just run with it. And even if there is some scandal, some stumbling block, which is the precise meaning of scandal, some stumbling block, they never really go anywhere with it. There's nobody with the gravitas to do that, and there's no news organization, no major news organization that has any financial interest or ideological interest in actually working out problems. Chris Hedges, in a recent article, noted a link between the inability to assign blame or address real issues of morality. And he wrote, quote, "Those with power have always manipulated reality and created ideologies defined as progress to justify systems of exploitation. Monarchs and religious authorities did this in the Middle Ages. Today, this is done by the high priests of modernity, the technocrats, scholars, scientists, politicians, journalists, and economists. They deform reality. They foster the myth of a preordained inevitability and pure rationality. But such knowledge, which dominates our universities, is anti-thought. It precludes all alternatives. It is used to end discussion. It is designed to give the forces of science or the free market or globalization a veneer of rational discourse, to persuade us to place our faith in these forces and trust our fate to them. These forces, the experts assure us, are as unalterable as nature. They will lead us forward. To question them is heresy. So writes Chris Hedges. Well, let's dive into a couple of the cases. I've got some cases here for you. You knew I'd do that. So let's start with John Kiriakou, who wrote recently, quote, "Torture may have made some Americans feel better in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks. It may have made them feel that government was avenging our fallen compatriots. But the report found that the harsh interrogation methods did not succeed in exacting useful intelligence. Whether or not it ever gleans useful intelligence, however, is beside the point. The question isn't whether torture works. Torture is immoral." And then he goes on, and the report he's speaking about, of course, is the Senate report on torture. It was heavily redacted. And he goes on to, Kiriakou goes on to say that Obama needs to belatedly do something about it. And of course the great question is, why is Obama not doing anything about it? Or about any of the other multitude of illegal, immoral, or insane actions that are taking place as I speak? So let's look at another report that recently came to light, although it was written back in 2012. Let's look at the report from the Defense Intelligence Agency, which sees the continuing rise of ISIS in the Middle East and had some interesting takes on exactly what all of that meant for the U.S. and its plans. So from the Levant report, Brad Hoff discusses the article, and it has some interesting quotes here and some links to it. I'll be putting this on the Facebook page so you can find it later if you'd like. But on Monday, May 18th, he writes, the conservative government watchdog group Judicial Watch published a selection of formerly classified documents obtained from the U.S. Department of Defense and State Departments through a federal lawsuit. And he makes the media connection. While the initial mainstream media reporting is focused on the White House's handling of the Benghazi consulate attack, a much bigger picture, much bigger admission and confirmation is contained in one of these documents circulated in 2012. That is, an Islamic State is desired in eastern Syria to affect the West's policies in the region. The newly declassified report states that, this is quoting the report now, for the West, Gulf countries and Turkey who support the Syrian opposition, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria, Hasaka and Dazor. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime. So the supporting powers is generally taken in this document to be the West, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, and Israel. So they see the Salafist movement, they see ISIS emerging, becoming powerful. They see that there's a very real possibility of them establishing themselves in a state in the area of the Turkish-Iraqi border. Now, why is this important? Well, given the State Department and the CIA's support, given their support with material to the ISIS Salafists in Syria, this suggests that we've actually been encouraging, actually it doesn't suggest, it says outright, we've been encouraging ISIS to grow and ISIS to thrive. There are some summary points that Brad Hoff raises, and I'll read these to you. Al-Qaeda drives the opposition in Syria. So Al-Qaeda is our ally. The West identifies with the opposition. That would be Al-Qaeda. The establishment of a nascent Islamic State became a reality only with the rise of the Syrian insurgency. I'll read that again. The establishment of a nascent Islamic State only became a reality with the rise of the Syrian insurgency. And Brad Hoff has a parenthetical remark here. There is no mention of U.S. troop withdrawal from Iraq as a catalyst for the Islamic State's rise, which is a contention of many politicians and pundits. All right, back to the points. The establishment of a Salafist principality in eastern Syria is exactly what the Western powers supporting the opposition want, identified as the West, Gulf countries, and Turkey, in order to weaken the Assad government. Safe havens are suggested in areas conquered by Islamic insurgents along the lines of the Libyan model. And that's working out so well, isn't it? That thousands of people are trying to leave every week just to get out of that hellhole that was Libya. Now here's an interesting bit. Iraq is identified with Shia expansion. That would mean Iran. So they see the West, the U.S., sees... This is where it really gets crazy. They see Iraq now as a Shia expansion of Iran, who sometimes we're at war with or hate, and other times we're not sure where we are with them. And this point, a Sunni Islamic State could be devastating to unifying Iraq. You think? And could lead to the renewing facilitation of terrorist elements from all over the Arab world entering into the Iraqi arena. So, how's that war on terrorism going for us here anyway? Well, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency, not terribly well. Not terribly well. And yet we know that from these documents that for the last 3 years, everybody, FBI, CIA, these documents were widely passed around, widely circulated. But, gee, it's not what they were telling us, is it? When the president or the generals get up there and talk about the need to stop stop ISIS. ISIS is the great boogeyman. And the U.S. actually sees it as an ally and apparently, in fact, is materially supporting it. So that's what I will submit that as evidence of what I'm saying, that there is no consistency. There's no idea that could be identified with reason or justice or freedom or humanity or minimizing suffering. It's all about this chessboard of U.S. power. Not that that's terribly surprising, but what is terribly surprising is how technocratic their thinking is. It's all just pieces in a game. It's pieces on a chessboard. It's all just moves. None of it's terribly important. Well, here's another story I will submit as evidence. And that's all these discourses that have been released into the world with Seymour Hersh's bin Laden story. And what do we hear? Lies, more lies, denial. Let's slander Hersh. But hey, I don't know that anybody's really much paying attention to this. It certainly hasn't seemed to cause a lot of uproar among the populace. I don't see people out, demanding the truth, demanding to know what's going on. And after all, we are getting into baseball season, and NASCAR's coming up, and there's just so many other things to do than to think about the lies that government may be telling. But the interesting bit of the bin Laden stories, and there are several, the most interesting bit about this story is that it reaches into the heart of other U.S. activities in the Middle East, and especially into the heart of the U.S. relationship with the Saudi government. But for one doubtful video, writes Lindin, bin Laden never took credit for 9/11. In fact, he repeatedly denied any responsibility for those mass murders. But, we had him on the hook for it. He was the guy, and all kinds of secret evidence we can't know about. And then there was the great story that was told for a while by the administration about how torturing people got the evidence of where bin Laden was, and it ended up in that farcical film, that PR production of the CIA called Zero Dark 30. And what do we have as proof of the government's story of how it really happened? Quoting Lindin again, to prove his birth, Obama showed us an electronic file, then jokingly a cartoon excerpt. But to prove bin Laden's death, Obama's handlers have given us nothing but a cartoon narrative suitable only for dim-witted children. The bloody crooks hustling us must be incredulous, if not laughing uproariously at what they can get away with from this nation of suckers. And Lindin wrote this in 2011. In 2011. Talked about that picture of Obama in the Situation Room, surrounded by his top security people, and they're watching something and no one's looking at the camera. And Den writes, again, this is to convey that the photo was natural and spontaneous. They're not posing for a propaganda shot, God forbid. The image is authentic. In fact, that it borders on the illicit. That's how authentic it is. So this was their secret session. George Bush had his giant plastic turkey that he was walking around with in his little pop-in Iraq. And then the White House said, they were watching live footage of the SEAL team going in and shooting Obama. And then they had to back off and explain that there really was no live feed of that moment. The camera didn't work for 25 of the 38 minutes of the raid. So absolutely no video footage of bin Laden, but Lindin asks, reasonably, why this sudden reversal? Can't these people work out their lies before they broadcast them to us? The White House had to backtrack because it had painted itself into a corner. It had already refused to produce photos of bin Laden. He'd been shot in the eye, it said, shattering his skull, so such a gory image would inflame Muslim sentiments. We don't want to spike the football, Obama said. But Lindin asked reasonably, if we couldn't see a photo of bin Laden, certainly we could have seen a photo of him alive if we couldn't see the body. But really, that would just be too much as well. But let's move on to Sy Hersh's comments, Sy Hersh's issues here, because those really go to the heart of this matter. Justin Raimondo takes up with some clarity, some great clarity, the Sy Hersh article and the reception that it's gotten. Right? Raimondo writes for Anti-War, saying, "Who said this? I'm not saying that they're at the highest levels, but I believe that somewhere in the government people know where Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda is, where Mullah Omar and the leadership of the Afghan Taliban is, and we expect more cooperation to help us bring justice, capture or kill those who attacked us on 9/11. All right, well, that was Hillary Clinton in 2011. That was her. So Pakistani government denied, was terribly shocked about all of this, and said, quote, I can assure you that he would not be a free man. That was Fatullah Babar, presidential spokesperson from Pakistan. But of course, Hirsch didn't say he was a free person. He didn't say bin Laden was free. In fact, he said something quite different. He said that, I'm going to drop that one. I got to go. My papers are getting a little bit out of order here, and that's always a nightmare. Anyway, I'll get back to it. I apologize for that. Okay, let's move on with the article. A worrying factor about all this is what is ignored by all these critics of Hirsch's article. According to a retired officer, a worrying factor at the early point was Saudi Arabia, which had been financing bin Laden's upkeep since his seizure by the Pakistanis. Quote, the Saudis didn't want bin Laden's presence revealed to us because he was a Saudi. So they told the Pakistanis to keep him out of the picture. The Saudis feared if we knew, we would pressure the Pakistanis to let bin Laden start talking to them about what the Saudis had been doing with al-Qaeda. And they were dropping money, lots of it. The Pakistanis, in turn, were concerned that the Saudis might spill the beans about their control of bin Laden. The fear was that if the U.S. found out about bin Laden from Riyadh, all hell would break out. Americans learning about bin Laden's imprisonment from a walk-in was not the worst thing. So Raimundo asks reasonably, what would have been the worst thing? Imagine if bin Laden, instead of being killed in a firefight, according to the official government-approved story, or simply murdered, according to Hirsch, had been captured alive. If Hirsch's reporting is correct, and I believe it is, then a whole can of worms Washington has gone to a great deal of trouble to keep sealed would have come pouring out. It would indeed, because a lot of this would embarrass the Saudis, our good friends and allies, but also because it would link the Saudi government back to 9/11. And this is a big deal. From people who have seen the sealed 28 pages on Saudi Arabia in the 9/11 report, such as Representative Stephen Lynch. Lynch says, there are people named, there are transactions identified about the Saudis, about the Saudi government and their involvement. You'd think that would be big news, wouldn't you? So Bob Graham of Florida said that the Saudi government directly aided the hijackers and that the FBI covered it up. Representative Thomas Massey described his reaction upon reading the censored 28 pages. It was a really disturbing event for me to read. I had to stop every 2 or 3 pages and rearrange my perception of history. And it's that fundamental. It certainly changes your view of the Middle East. So how has the mainstream media received Hirsch's article? With calm, deliberate reading and discussion? Nah, not so much. Not so much of that at all. What have they given us? And when you get right down to it, what's the mainstream media said that has any credibility whatsoever about the whole darned issue? They've attacked Seymour Hersh. Let's shoot the messenger. Hey, what a great idea. Let's shoot the messenger. And that's how we work. So if we look at this handling of bin Laden and handling of the Seymour Hersh story and all such things, then what we end up with is a view of government which is comically incompetent, and it would be laughable if it wasn't so dangerous, so disastrous. But the government certainly appears partly incompetent, but partly incoherent. And then we had that wonderful article just recently in Harper's by David Bromwich. If you haven't read it, get a copy of the current Harper's and read it. Obama's Failings. What Went Wrong? It's the title of the article. And a lot of people are making a lot of hay out of this. In particular, Russia Insider had some interesting takes on the whole piece. This was an editorial. David Bromwich summarizes the lost chances of Obama presidency to generate real change in U.S. domestic and foreign policy and make a clear break from the policies of the Bush-Cheney administration. That much is true about the article. Bromwich, one of the top professors from Yale University, criticizes Obama for choosing, quote, the path of least resistance and not making enough sacrifices for his views and pre-election promises. In a page on the U.S. role in the Ukraine conflict, the author elucidates what we've been saying all along here at Russia Insider. Referring to the aftermath of the coup, Bromwich writes, quote, The later stages of the enterprise called for the defamation of Vladimir Putin, which went into high gear with the 2014 Sochi Olympics and has not abated. When Nuland arrived in Kiev to hand out cookies to anti-Russian protesters, it was as if a Russian had arrived to cheer a mass of anti-American protesters in Baja California. That's what Bromwich wrote. And the Russian Insider responded with, we have witnessed 18 months of relentless, unwarranted 18 months of relentless, unwarranted Russia bashing by the corporate media and Western diplomats. Bromwich is one of those rare scholars who's willing to admit that. Bromwich goes on to say, excuse me, that neocons took hold of Obama's foreign policy, letting Obama off the hook for the Ukraine chaos. That he, choosing the path of least resistance, did not object, as it absolved him of all responsibility for the outcome. Through the many months of assisted usurpation, no word of reprimand was ever issued from President Obama. An intercepted phone call in which Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador to Ukraine, could be heard picking the leaders of the government they aimed to install after the coup, aroused no scandal in the American press. But what could Obama have been thinking? Was he remotely aware of the implications of the crisis, a crisis that plunged Ukraine into a civil war and splintered U.S. democracy with Russia? His subsequent statements on the matter have all been delivered in a sedative nudge language that speaks of measures to change the behavior of a greedy rival power. As in Libya, the evasion of responsibility has been hard to explain. It almost looks as if a cell of the State Department assumed the management of Ukraine policy, and the president was helpless to alter their design. Remember when I was talking about a coup at the top of the show? Okay, I'll read that sentence again just so we can make the connection. As in Libya, the evasion of responsibility has been hard to explain. It almost looks as if a cell of the State Department assumed the management of Ukraine policy, and the president was helpless to alter their design. Now, that is interesting. Was Obama actually helpless to affect U.S. foreign policy? Bromwich wrote, about this matter, wrote about Obama's frequent change of mind. There is a sense, commonly felt but rarely reflected upon by the American Republic, in which at critical moments a figure like John Brennan or Victoria Nuland may matter more than the president himself. And Russia Insider looks at this and says there could be no surer confirmation of the fact than the frequent inconsequence of the president's words, or to put it another way, by the embarrassing frequency with which his words are contradicted by subsequent events. Bromwich adds, Edward Snowden, in an interview published in The Nation in November 2014, seems to have identified the pattern. The Obama administration, he said, almost appears as though it is afraid of the intelligence community. They're afraid of death by 1,000 cuts, leaks, and things like that. Russia Insider concludes the article saying, John Brennan gave substance to this surmise when he told Charlie Rose recently that the new president in 2009 did not have a good deal of experience in national security, but now he has gone to school and understands the complexity. This is not the tone of a public servant talking about his superior. It is the tone of a schoolmaster describing an obedient pupil. And indeed it is. Indeed it is. Eric Zusa, always fun to read, picks up this issue as well. But he's citing a rather different bit. One is you have John Kerry talking to the Russians and Victoria Nuland talking to the Ukrainians, and they say completely different things. Okay. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry on May 12th responding to Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko's assertions that Ukraine will retake Crimea and conquer Donbass. This is Kerry now, quote, I have not had a chance. I have not read the speech. I haven't seen any context. I have simply heard about it in the course of today. But indeed, if President Poroshenko is advocating an engagement and a forceful effort at this time, we would strongly urge him to think twice not to engage in that kind of activity. That would put Minsk, the Minsk Accord, in serious jeopardy, and we would be very, very concerned about what the consequences of that kind of action at this time may be. Well, everybody would be very, very concerned about that, because Russia is not going to let it happen. So there's Kerry's statement. Then we go down to Victoria Nuland's statement on May 15th. It was communicated by the U.S. State Department press office. Assistant Secretary Nuland's ongoing visit to Kiev and her discussions with Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and President Poroshenko reaffirmed the United States' full and unbreakable support of Ukraine's government sovereignty and territorial integrity. That just sounds like a bloody bureaucrat, doesn't it? Full and unbreakable support of Ukraine's government sovereignty and territorial integrity. We continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people of Ukraine and reiterate our deep commitment to a single Ukrainian nation, including Crimea and all the other regions of Ukraine. Harumph. So here you have Assistant Secretary contradicting her boss 3 days after her boss spoke on a major issue of foreign policy. So is Kerry going to reprimand her? Is Obama going to fire her? And if she's not fired or reprimanded, Zusak makes an interesting point here. He says, if not, then who is to trust anything that comes from the U.S. State Department when the Secretary of State can be contradicted 3 days later by his subordinate and both remain in their respective jobs? Zeus points out the Republicans are all over this. John Kerry's 7 hours of weakness in Russia, attempting to push the reset button. Ah, dear, dear, dear. But Zeus's conclusions are interesting. Quote, if Victoria Nuland stays in her job, then John Kerry will be neutered, even if he's not fired. The only person with the power to fire Nuland is actually U.S. President Obama. Perhaps the request for him to do that is already on his desk. If not, then Kerry's job is in jeopardy, because his diplomatics can be obliterated by a subordinate, and that subordinate will suffer no penalty for doing this. Nobody would then respect anything that the U.S. Secretary of State says, because it wouldn't necessarily represent the president's policies. If the Secretary of State isn't backed up then by the president, then the Secretary of State has no real power at all. More evidence, this slippage of language, this slippage of ideology, this lunatic ignorance of the real consequences of actions, because they're just working the problems. Hey, just working the problems here. John Ralston Saul had an interesting bit on this. It's from his book, The Unconscious Civilization, and if there is one book that I think everyone must read, it would be John Ralston Saul's The Unconscious Civilization. Anyway, we can easily see that, quote, slippage within the bureaucracy shows how essentially directionless the corporatist system is. Once the idea of management for management's sake takes over, the organization, whatever it is, begins to skitter about aimlessly, following one expert system after another, obsessed by problem solving without really considering the problem in its own terms. And control. Everything is a matter of control. Yet control, like efficiency, is a secondary or tertiary business, well behind policy and purpose, and for that matter, effectiveness. He continues on a little farther down the page. A terrible fear possesses them, because in a pyramidal structure, there is no admission of the possibility of error. What did Robert McNamara learn from the Vietnam War? Not a damn thing. What did the State Department neocons and neolibs and neo-neos learn from Afghanistan, Iraq? Not a damn thing, apparently. So I state again my premise that a coup has taken place, that corporatists and neoconservatives and liberals have taken the government away from us. And our first step should be to slip off the shackles of corporatist thought and think all necessary thoughts and spread these as far as we can. One more bit from John Ralston Saul. What is new is the devotion of a whole elite to the bureaucratic ethic, that is, to management, as if it were a primary skill. This is a product of corporatism. It is what happens when you rank reason and method over content. Time is wasted on fights between interest groups, blaming each other for whatever it is they say is wrong. Whatever they claim, these fights are rarely over policy. These fights are over who gets what. In this context, There is no disinterest and no direction and no reward for thought or disinterested participation. The result is a growth within the population of a contempt for the elites. What follows from that is what we are now experiencing, the rise of a false populism, which is usually linked to the enemies of democracy. No disinterest, no reward for thought or disinterested participation. You've got to be all in. You've got to be completely loyal to the corporation, to the corporate interests, to the government, which follows this same mad ideology. Why aren't they in jail? Because nobody gets caught. Or they get caught, and they're loyal to the company. So as long as they're loyal to the company, loyal to the government, loyal to the party, loyal to the ideology, finally, at bottom, finally, loyalty to the ideology. You got to be a true believer. You can't go in lukewarm. They'll chew you up and spit you out. You got to be hot or cold. Loyal to the ideology. And so no one's ever punished. And so the system never changes. Because, indeed, treason profits. Treason profits. No one gets upbraided, no one gets fired, no one goes to jail. Theft, destruction of the Constitution, the creation of a populace which has increasing contempt for the government and the people in it and their ideas. But yet, they never articulate that. Instead, they turn to that other false populism that Saul writes about. So we get the Tea Party, and we got the Republicans scrambling around, and Hillary's trying to look all populist. And we got Bernie Sanders, who's in the race now on the Democratic side, and trying to kick up some populist support. But none of these people will really fix it, because the problem is not who is in the White House. It's really not. The problem is the ideology that undermines the whole of the country. The ideology of bureaucracy, management. In management, you've got to remember, management has to rule. Management has to write regs and laws. It has to rule. There's no interest in discussion or ideas. It's the pursuit of the ideological ends that, above all, trumps. And that brings me to the end of today's show. I would like to thank all of you for listening and to apologize for my little lapse there in the middle of it all. Some days are clearer than others. You know how that is. Well, you've been listening to Long Waves Radio with Gary Krug on KYRS, Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3. As always, this show is podcast live, or you can find the podcast live. Gosh, listen to me. I'm not terribly clear today. The show is streamed live on kyrs.org. It is podcast on YouTube. Just put Long Waves Radio in quotes. Search on YouTube. You'll turn me right over. You can also find Long Waves Radio on Facebook, and I'll have links to the shows on there, as well as a place for you to respond, make suggestions, do all kinds of other things like that. And I often put, as I say, the references to the shows on there so you can look at them for yourself and make up your own minds about things, which is ultimately what you're going to have to do anyway. You can also email me. All kinds of ways you can get in touch with me. You can email me at longwaves@kyrs.org. And once again, I thank you for listening. I'll be back next week with another new show, and hopefully I'll be a little less tongue-tied then. Thank you again. Till next week. Be smart. Be safe. Pay attention.